I know a lot of people are just getting in, but we are going to get started at 6 o'clock just so we can save our time here today. So welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Kim Kanali'i. I'm the community outreach nurse at Valley Medical Center. We're here to bust some COVID myths today with the help of our experts, who I will ask to introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, a few things to note. To start, this presentation is being recorded. So if you miss anything, or you want to go back and listen, or you want to share what you learned with your family and friends, the video will be posted on our YouTube page and shared across the social media pages of each of the organizations hosting this event in a few days. Next, I'd like to say an enormous thank you to MultiCare in both the Covington and Maple Valley Chambers of Commerce for bringing us all together today in support of our community and to do what we can to fight misinformation. With that in mind, thank you to everyone who sent in questions ahead of time. We've collected all of our community questions and we've separated them into some common themes for our panelists to address. So we'll do our best to make sure each of these questions that were sent in are answered. But if we miss something, we encourage you to talk to your primary care provider who knows your healthcare history and they can more specifically address your questions and concerns. If you have any questions during the town hall, please don't hesitate to type them into the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time we have. Our hope today is to provide useful and factual information to our community while still recognizing that everyone has a right to make their own decisions. We are just here to give you the tools you need to make the most informed healthcare decisions for you and your family. So with all of that out of the way, let's meet our experts. Alphabetically, Dr. Hori, I'll ask that you go first.
Okay, my name is Mike Hori, and I am the director of the infectious disease section at Valley Medical Center in Renton.
And I'm Mike Mintz. I am a infectious disease physician like Dr. Hori and an epidemiologist, and I'm working with MultiCare's COVID response, as well as my day job is population health executive with MultiCare.
Excellent. Thank you both so much for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mint first, who's going to start us off with some basic COVID information so we're all starting on the same page.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. And it really is a pleasure for me to participate in this town hall. And like I said, this is an area where obviously, Dr. Hori and myself will contribute our perspective on this disease, kind of how it's progressed, where we are today. I'm going to show some epidemiology slides in regards to how this epidemic has progressed. I'll call out some particular topics that I know we'll have some time to talk about in a little bit. So can we go on to the next slide, please? This is a screen that it's sort of seared into my sort of mental vision here. This is the Johns Hopkins slide that is a really nice summary of where we are in the world with COVID. The red number, total number of cases, is of diagnosed positive cases. It underestimates the number of actual cases in the world, probably by a pretty big factor. But right now, 241 million people in the world have validated or verified COVID infections. Nearly 5 million deaths across the world, again, that have been diagnosed specifically. And in many developing countries, there's just not the testing capability there. And the green number, I want to point out, 6.6 billion, with a B, billion doses of COVID vaccines have been given out across the planet. You can see on the upper right, that is the timeline and the epidemic curve. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail when I talk about Washington state numbers. Deaths, unfortunately, have followed that, which is the white curve on the right. And then vaccine dosing, you can see, has sort of coming off of a spike and then maybe decreasing a little bit in the last several weeks to months. Next slide, please. I like to look at specific countries that are more similar to here in the United States in regards to vaccination rates and some of the other aspects of those countries. I'll particularly talk about the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan here, in the sense that all three are highly vaccinated countries, and these are their epidemiology curves. In the green, and unfortunately with very high levels right now, is the United Kingdom. And I only want to point out that this most recent surge you can see starting in June of this year is all the Delta wave in the United Kingdom. So that was the Delta wave, this strain of COVID that was first identified in India, but definitely hit most parts of the world and represents more than 99% of the cases here in the United States, and same in the United Kingdom. You could see that they've had a very high and ongoing peak of this, which is of concern because they have similar vaccination rates to what we have here in the United States. The United States curve, you can see, had gone pretty far up with this current Delta wave and has come back down again. But you can see it perhaps is bottoming out a little bit, which is probably not too surprising that we're going into respiratory season, traditionally a season where the weather gets colder, people start to congregate closer together, schools are in session, and so we tend to see respiratory diseases that spread similar to COVID. Canada had a lower curve. This is a per capita rate, so it's per population. They've had a lower curve. They have a smaller population. In Japan, you could see their Delta wave curve and the red curve down below, perhaps associated a little bit with the Olympics and some of the other public activities, but that has come down quite a bit, and they're a highly vaccinated country also, and with high mask use. Next slide, please. You can go back one slide. This is hospitalizations per capita also. So looking at it, population adjusted, you can see that our hospitalization rates were much higher than that in the United Kingdom, but coming down. United Kingdom has sort of plateaued off, which is not surprising given that I showed the number of new cases there. And Canada is just kind of plateauing off also here. But you can see that it's hit hospitalizations pretty strongly in the population here with this Delta wave. And that's despite having higher vaccination levels. The Delta strain is so contagious and affects so many people. Next slide, please. This is Washington State numbers, and I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about these waves that we've seen come through. These first two relatively small waves in the blue, sorry, let me orient you to the slide. The blue are cases, so these are documented cases of COVID. Down below is hospitalizations in the yellow kind of orange curves. And you could see it starts with early 2020 when we first started seeing cases here in Washington State, all the way up to the most recent numbers here. And you can see all the way on the right, oh, sorry, if you can go back, all the way on the right, it is grayed out because the numbers aren't finalized yet. So I just wanted to orient you to that slide. The first two waves were the wild type strain that was first identified in Wuhan province of China. And I just want to point out that the first wave is really small because we didn't have a lot of testing capabilities. In fact, even by the second wave, we didn't have full-on widely available testing until probably a little closer to this third wave, which was during the respiratory season, which you can see around January spiked pretty high up there in number of new cases, as well as hospitalizations. I'll only say that both Valley Hospital and the UW system, as well as the multi-care system, as well as all of the other healthcare systems in Washington State, were very, very full in the winter between 2020 and 2021. That was mostly a strain called the Eta strain, which was first identified in California, which was a slight variant on the Wuhan strain. This next wave in April was the Alpha strain, which was first seen in the UK, and you could see that we started vaccinating. That peak was a little bit lower than that of the wintertime. But once Delta came, and Delta is at least twice as contagious as the original strain, had this big peak that matched or exceeded the winter peak in new cases and also in hospitalizations here in Washington State. And that's because the virus continues to evolve. And as long as there are cases happening, any one human infected with COVID has 1 trillion replications of virus, each one potentially leading to a mutation that can make the virus a little bit more contagious or able to spread to others, or a little more resistant to immunity. So that's the concern, and that's one of the challenges that we have. So I just wanted to orient to kind of how we've experienced COVID here. And I know everyone on the call, has seen these different waves kind of come and affected all of us in different ways. Next slide, please. This is deaths, and unfortunately, COVID here in Washington State, the deaths have really gone along these different waves. And you could see that this wave during the last winter time here around January, we had quite a few deaths. the wave of the alpha strain that came in really wasn't particularly fatal for folks, and the vaccination seemed to have been working, especially for the elderly at that time. And then the Delta wave, with its high contagiousness, had a large mortality rate, but I'll show you here that that mortality rate was mostly in unvaccinated individuals here in Washington State. I also want to point out the little insert here. This is just showing that COVID as was the #2 cause of death in September of this year, just behind heart disease. And overall, the last winter time, where you see that big peak in January, it was the leading cause of death in Washington State last winter time. And we're hoping that that doesn't happen this winter time. Next slide, please. This is a slide that shows relative risk, and this is from King County data that King County updates. I have the website link here, and we can certainly share it with anybody. This is a really good way to look at the data. And know that vaccinations, this looks at vaccinated versus unvaccinated individuals. And what vaccination does is reduce your risk, but doesn't make it zero. And that's the same with influenza vaccinations, the same with most vaccinations. Most vaccinations are not 100%, but they decrease that risk. And this is a great slide because in getting COVID, vaccinated versus unvaccinated individuals, vaccinated individuals are 9 times less likely to get COVID, but you can still get COVID. But you can see that for hospitalizations, for becoming sick enough to be hospitalized, it's a 48-fold risk reduction, 48 times less likely if you're vaccinated to be hospitalized than an unvaccinated person who gets COVID. And for those folks who have, the significant complication and die from COVID, it's 69 times. And they update this every week. So this is just from the 14th, the last one that I pulled this slide from. It changes a little bit based on the way that folks come into our hospital system, but this is a good example of risk reduction. And I only say this, one of the things that recently made the news and really wanted to just say to Colin Powell's family and people who loved and respect him, condolences. But the fact that he died and was vaccinated, he had a lot of other comorbidities. And his relative risk of dying from this was lower. But if you have other immunocompromising conditions, and I wasn't his physician, so I don't know his whole medical history, but if you have other chronic medical conditions, it does change that risk profile and how much the vaccine reduces, which is why the CDC recommended a 3rd dose for certain immunocompromised individuals for patients who received the Pfizer vaccine and are currently evaluating that for Moderna and J&J. Next slide, please. This is also the Delta strain and prior strains have really disproportionately also affected children for multiple reasons. Not only that they can get the disease and have other complications from the disease like multi-organ inflammatory syndromes, but also that 120,000 children in the US experienced death of a primary caregiver. And that number is probably closer to 175,000 now with Delta. This was data right before the Delta strain hit. 22,000 children experienced the death of secondary caregivers, and children who are in racial ethnic minority groups are disproportionately affected. And 1.3 million children have had their primary caregivers worldwide affected by this. So children are affected not only by the disease itself, but by what happens to their families and caregivers. Next slide, please. A couple of things that are upcoming, and we'll talk about that a little more as we start to help address some of the questions that were submitted. But I just wanted to update on what the FDA is doing and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, which is part of the Center for Disease Control, or CDC. I only want to orient folks that there are 2 bodies that weigh in on vaccines. The FDA weighs in on and gives recommendations by an advisory panel within the FDA, and then their leadership approves it, then moves it on to the ACIP, which is a subgroup of the CDC, and then their leadership either adjusts or approves it. And so I'll talk about where we are. So booster shots right now have been moved on by the FDA for Johnson & Johnson, Janssen vaccine, or Moderna vaccines, and moved on to the ACIP CDC groups for final recommendations in regards to booster shots for these 2 vaccines. There's also discussions going on at the same time on mixing and matching different vaccine types and whether or not the FDA and ACIP CDC will approve that. That's also going through current evaluation. And then the Pfizer vaccine is being evaluated also by the FDA and ACIP groups for children's age 5 to 11 years. It's to be reviewed on the 26th. And so we're looking forward to seeing that for vaccinations becoming available for children between the ages of 5 and 11 years old. There's also new treatments going through the FDA review. Molnupiravir is a drug and oral therapy going through the FDA process right now, which has shown some promise. So that's the current work in the FDA. There's a lot more going on there, but these are the ones that have made the headlines that I just wanted to refer to. And let's go to the last slide. One of the things is that we talk COVID, but as I mentioned, we're entering the respiratory season. And I only wanted to show the graph on the left, which is respiratory syncytial virus. The left is 2 years ago, the respiratory season. In the middle is actually last respiratory season, where we saw very little respiratory syncytial virus because of a lot of the public health initiatives, masking, physical distancing, a lot of the school closures. But this year we're already seeing RSV, and it's a little bit early in the season here to be seeing the RSV kind of peak go up. So we're already seeing this. This mostly affects very young children, but can affect immunocompromised older individuals. And then influenza, we're not seeing a lot of this. Green is good for influenza. You can see Washington State is still in the green with minimal influenza, but we're tracking this really carefully as kids are back in school. And we really recommend getting the influenza vaccine also to reduce your relative risk of getting complications for influenza. So I'm going to end the presentation there and hand back to Kim. I just wanted to give a little bit of a sense of where we've been, a little bit of context of where we're going, and then Dr. Horie and myself will answer some of the questions that have come up. Kim, I'll hand back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Mint. So now we know a little more. Let's talk about vaccines. This is an area a lot of people feel fear about. There's a lot of unknown. So I know you both kind of got a little bit to talk about in this topic, but what can you tell us about the technology behind the vaccines that allowed them to be approved so quickly and why they're important?
Okay, well, let me talk a little bit about why vaccines are important. I think people have gotten their fill of that. Oh, incidentally, I really want to express my appreciation to Dr. Mint for that wonderful presentation. That was a tremendous summary, and I'm just flabbergasted by the 1 trillion replications of the virus in the body. That's a fact that I didn't know, and it's very impressive, actually, that this virus can causes such a severe infection, which is really one of the importance of the vaccinations. I think Dr. Mint has really touched on some very important critical issues with regard to the vaccination. It really reduces your risk of getting sick. There's just a huge amount of data right now over the last 10 months about how much it helps. One of the things that he showed us already was the King County data, which suggests that you're 48% times less likely to be hospitalized and 69% or 69 times less likely to die if you're vaccinated. And that's like super important. Other organizations have come up with similar sort of data. The CDC shows now that you're 10 times less likely to be hospitalized, 10 times less likely to die if you're vaccinated. And that's really nothing to sneer about. It's also worthwhile knowing that, COVID is not just a lethal disease. It's also what we call in medicine a morbid disease. It can make you really sick. So there was a study here that was just published in California recently. They did a survey of people who'd gotten COVID disease, and they asked them, a couple months out, have you still have problems? And about a third of all the people who they surveyed had symptoms 2 or more months after they had the disease. And these included severe fatigue, loss of taste and smell, shortness of breath, and chronic muscle and joint pains, which were, reasonably disabling. And they're not the only symptoms you can have that will linger on from COVID. You can get, I have a nephew who got a brain fog that was so severe, he couldn't work for 2 months. He had a hard time remembering his name for 2 months. It was really severe. You can get chest pain, you can get a nagging cough, you can get headaches that last for a long time, described as jackhammer in many patients. Depression and fever are also long haul problems. And, there is a subset of people who not only have these things for a couple months, some of them go on for 6 months. As we get further and further out with this epidemic, we're finding now that people can be sick for longer and longer period of time after they get it. So if you don't die, you don't spend a huge amount of time in the hospital, you can still be pretty sick. Another good reason to get a vaccination is that although we're not quite as sure about Delta as we were about some of the other variants, we believe, number one, you can spread the disease less if you don't have it. I mean, if you're, 9 times less likely to get the disease, you're 9 times less likely to spread it to other people. Not only that, it does appear that if you look at the epidemiologic studies, you're about 50% less likely to spread the disease, even if you do get it. The vaccination somehow protects you from spreading, possibly because you're infected for less time. People can spread the disease for as long as a week if they're not vaccinated. It's usually about 3 days if they are. So, I mean, there's a couple different reasons why you are less infectious to other people. And that's like super important because that's how we get out of this epidemic. If we, each of us, if we can prevent other people from getting the disease from us, that's one way that we're shutting this down and we're getting back to normal. So that's a really important thing. And it is, of course, very important to help us protect our loved ones. I don't know how many times in this last week where I've been rounding on the COVID wards, where I've been seeing people who are in their 80s and 90s who are fully vaccinated, but the people around them weren't and gave them disease. And they weren't really sick, and I don't expect them to get really sick because they've been vaccinated, but it's still inconvenient for them. Finally, I guess there's one other, kind of cold fact about this that probably needs to be brought up. In the first year, hospitals and insurance companies, for the most part, waived the cost for people who are hospitalized with COVID. There is no federal mandate for this. And since January of this year, insurance companies have been quietly rolling out the cost sharing for people who are infected with COVID and their healthcare costs. And as the end of October, a survey recently was done that shows that 82% of the top 2 private insurance companies for every state, which would probably be Regence and Premier for our state, are now going to cost sharing with their patients. Another study looked at how much that might actually be for somebody who's hospitalized with COVID. And it turns out that if you happen to be privately insured, that out-of-pocket cost could be as high as $4,000. And if you happen to be in a Medicare Med Advantage program, that could be as high as $1,600. So there's another really good reason, because vaccines right now continue to be free. And that's a really good economic reason potentially for getting vaccinated. So it helps you from getting really sick, helps you from being hospitalized, helps you from dying. It helps those around you, and it might actually help your pocketbook. So there's so many different good reasons for getting vaccinated with regard to this. So with regard to the technology that was used to be able to create the vaccines, and your concerns about getting vaccinated, I'm going to turn it over again to Dr. Ment and let him go ahead and address some of those issues.
So, I think that one of the things that we really appreciate is that all of us have to make that risk-benefit decision for ourselves, our loved ones that we're responsible for. And I'll put it in a little context because I think that Dr. Horry really mentioned well the benefits of the vaccine. So let me talk a little bit about the risk side of the vaccine equation. First, how was it created? One thing that is maybe misunderstood a little bit is how long mRNA technology has been around. In vaccines, it's been actively studied for at least a decade, or a little bit more, in multiple other diseases. One of the rate limiting steps is just that it's a very expensive technology. And if you could do it more cheaply using other technologies, but it's been shown to actually be very safe. And they looked at it for rabies, for Ebola, and for influenza, and for several other diseases. And so it's been tested over multiple times over the last 10 years and a little longer than that. And it's been shown to be safe in these studies. The other thing that I want to point out is that the Operation Warp Speed was initiated. This is a bipartisan development program. This was arguably one of the greatest triumphs of the Trump administration, was really launching, looking at 5 different technologies to see which one would be the most effective, safe way to get vaccines out. And people always ask me, was this rushed? And the timeline was certainly reduced from the regular way that vaccines in a non-epidemic would go forth. And I think there were good reasons for that, because we were seeing COVID. And I did show you the number of deaths and how this was spreading throughout. And because of a lot of the public health initiatives, we were able to decrease that, but only with a vaccine are we going to be able to really start to move back towards a more normal type of economy and lifestyle. So even though the timeline was reduced in regards to the way that this went through, the FDA and the ACIP required the same steps to go through. They just got through a lot of the red tape, and a lot of money was put forth in both a public-private partnership to move these through. So were they moved through? Did they shortcut any of the steps? The answer is not the actual steps of doing things. They actually went through step A, B, C, D for the development. And I only point out that some of the comments that I've gotten, or the questions that I've gotten from our patients in our communities, were how long have we been able to study these? A couple of facts about that. One, most vaccine side effects, if they happen at all, generally are earlier on in the vaccine timeline. And that could be some of the just immediate side effects of getting the shot, but also any of the other effects, that including myocarditis or any of the issues that may be associated with rare blood clotting issues and other issues. This has been the most well-studied vaccine rollout in the history of vaccines. The other part of this is that the original cohort, which was about 100,000, if you add in all of the 3 different groups, they all started about May to June of 2020. They're well over a year and a half out for the initial group study, and there are no other adverse events outside of those that have already been identified in the most rigorous vaccine follow-up. I've never had a vaccine before, and I don't know if anyone else has, where I've had an app asking me how am I doing all the time, which is the V-Safe app that we've had. And one of the other things that you just have to understand about the V-Safe app is that it shows what they wanted to do was be very sensitive, find any potential complications. But just because I put in, hey, I had like some pain around the site and stuff, it doesn't necessarily prove causality. And I only want to say that that's where the scientists and others come in and evaluate all of the data. And really, it's been remarkable that we've been able to find very rare side effects from these vaccines, and then do the risk-benefit analysis, and then make certain recommendations to continue to do this, because the benefit clearly outweighs the risk from a scientific medical perspective. Back to you.
That's so true. When they found the clotting problem, that was 6 cases out of 6.8 million vaccines. That makes finding a needle in a haystack look easy. And yet they did it. I mean, Mike is right. We have studied this vaccine more than any other vaccine that's ever been done. And again, I just want to go ahead and point out that a lot of this had to do with the financing from the government and the private and government sectors, including the Trump administration, who helped them to go ahead and not only study the vaccine, but they created a manufacturing process for producing the vaccines in parallel, because they were financed so well. There wasn't as much risk for the pharmaceutical companies, so they felt comfortable in doing these 2 processes. So when they found out they had a winner of a vaccine, they also had a machinery for producing it, which is typically a couple of years delay. So, when you look at the production of vaccines, for the most part, a lot of the delays are just mechanical. It has nothing to do with the science of being able to understand whether the vaccine works or whether it's safe. It just has to do with trying to figure out how to get it out there to people, how to produce it. And again, I think that was one of the greatest things that they did in the previous administration, was to be able to go ahead and give people, the pharmaceutical companies, the comfort to go ahead and do both those things at once, which is why we got this out.
I know we've got quite a few questions we want to get through, but there are still
Okay.
2, I think, in this realm that would be good to answer. And one, we talked about why people should get the vaccine, but somebody wanted to know why immunity from having COVID is not as good as the vaccine.
There are plenty of studies out there that show that the immunity from the infection is actually very, very good. As a matter of fact, there was a recent publication, which I came across here in the last week, that showed that right now, given that we've had this outbreak now for, I'm not very good at, well, it'd be about 20 months now, all told. But the study just came out that showed that the immunity from an infection can last as long as 15 months with good, robust antibodies. But there is a problem out there that makes me worry about this situation that has more to do with sort of community epidemiology, particularly in other countries. So there were places in Brazil that had a horrid infection with the early strains of the virus that Dr. Mint was pointing out. You remember those first two little spikes that they had there in April and May of 2020. In Brazil, it just flattened some of the communities. Maybe some of you have heard that our blood banks are showing now that we have about an 80% rate of having antibody in our blood if you look at our blood supplies to spike protein of COVID. In this particular community, which was called Manaus, which was at where the Amazon is created, they had a 76% antibody positivity after that first wave. And yet, when another wave came through, now called the Gamma virus, came through that community in the winter of 2020, that entire community went through a huge wave. It was flattened again. And somehow natural immunity does not seem to be as protective as the vaccinations have proven to be for variants as they come through. And so I think that it's still important, even if you've had an infection, to get vaccinated. The other important thing about getting that vaccination after you've had the infection is, quite frankly, you're bulletproof if you get it, because they're the highest antibody production that will neutralize this virus and protect you from that infection are in those individuals who had the infection and then got the vaccination afterwards. I mean, it's just phenomenal how well protected they are. So, I mean, that's a real bonus. So on one side, if you have the natural infection, you may not need you may not feel like you need the vaccination, but you're potentially taking risks if a new wave of a variant comes through that it may not work quite against, versus getting the vaccination and having the infection and having, tremendous immunity. And what appears to be most of the variants that are available. There is actually, as Dr. Meadows pointed out, Great Britain has had a little bit of uptick in their epidemic wave, because they're now seeing the subvariants of Delta. There's one now called AY 4.2, which we have not seen in the US. Thank goodness it's not there, but it has been slowly replacing its parent Delta virus in Britain. So again, I think it's really important that you, even if you've had an infection, get that vaccine. It's free. It's going to protect you like no other if you do get it. Yeah.
And one of the other things I'll just add is that, similar, and when we talk about these different variants, we have an example for slightly different reasons, but it's similar from an infectious epidemiology perspective of influenza and why you need a flu shot every season.
That's absolutely
because
right.
Flu continues to mutate and change from year to year going forward. And vaccines work slightly differently than a native infection. And currently, we're developing different vaccines for some of the subsequent strains. Right. So even if you've had even the Delta strain right now, which is 99% of the circulating strains here in the United States, there may be a time when a different variant comes off that has figured out its way to be less affected by immunity from a prior infection. Vaccines may come back into real importance at that point. So, more studies to come on that, but I completely concur with Dr. Horry's example. And that example from Brazil really did sort of give pause to a lot of us in regards to just native infective immunity.
Right.
So let's talk about boosters. What should we know about vaccine boosters and why are we recommending them?
Well, right now, as Dr. Mint has pointed out, we only have one that's been, well, actually there are two situations, because there are really three situations in which more vaccinations would be a useful thing for people to have. The first situation, which is one that was sort of authorized by FDA and ACIP for both Pfizer and Moderna this summer, was the individuals who get a vaccination, but they just don't react very well to it. Why? Because their immune system is beat up for some reason. It could be that they have an underlying problem, like they've had an organ transplant, or it could be they may be on cancer chemotherapy, or it could be that they're on some sort of drug for like a arthritis type of condition that will kind of cause their immune system to not react as well to that vaccination. And it's been shown in several studies that if you give that population of individuals, those people who didn't react all that well the first time, you give them that third vaccination, they do better. For instance, if you take a population of individuals who've had a kidney transplant, only about a third will react fully to the point where they might be immune to the disease. With those two vaccinations, if you get a third one, they get up closer to 60%. It's not 100%, but it does help that particular population. So those we've been calling third vaccinations, not truly boosters, because it's basically part of their vaccination series to bring them up to where most of us with normal immune systems would be. Now there's the next group is those individuals who actually got a pretty good immune response. And we're seeing this kind of all over the world in certain populations, that the amount of antibody that will neutralize this virus and will protect you from getting this infection begins to wane over time. This has probably been the most studied in Israel, where they noticed fairly quickly, because they were the first people to really get off the mark and get those Pfizer vaccines out there. They were also the first people that did the studies that realized that it wasn't 100% all across, but there was a little bit of a drop. For instance, there was a drop in the Pfizer vaccine in a recent Kaiser study between 91% protection from any infection to about 77% over the first 3 months with the Pfizer vaccine. Now, there's a couple things you have to know about this. The first is that because these people start out with pretty good immunity to start with these vaccinations, the protection against severe disease, hospitalization, and death for all these vaccines, despite this waning antibody, remains very, very good, 90% or better. So it's not really the protection against severe disease that we're worried about. It's trying to protect people from any infection. And so now to be able to help reduce the spread of the disease, to help to open up our society again, perhaps to help a few people avoid being very sick, the FDA has and the ACIP have approved the use of the Pfizer vaccine as a booster. And as Dr. Mendes pointed out, it's really likely that the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, or the J&J vaccine boosters, are going to be following in the very, very near future. And again, boosters really are the way that we get ourselves out of this, by reducing the amount of infection that we see in society and the spread of this disease. So that's, I do think that that's really important. There is a third reason for getting a booster, and that is for individuals who work with sick people all the time, or work with a lot of people all the time. We can be giving boosters to them to be able to maintain good immunity, to protect them from infection altogether, so they don't spread it. So that's where giving vaccinations to healthcare workers actually comes in, is you want those people to be very protected, so they'll protect other people who they're working with who are sicker and have more debilitated immune systems. And I have to admit that also it's useful for people who are essential workers to keep them from getting sick and not being in work, because if they do get infected, they're out for 10 to 14 days. So we'd like to be able to keep those people in their jobs so they can continue to keep our society running. So that's the third reason why people get boosters at this particular time. And we'll just have to wait. We'll have more information coming up. Sometimes there are some curveballs in how the ACIP recommends boosters or vaccinations after the FDA is done.
And we had another question. I think we've already addressed, I think Dr. Mint talked about it a bit, but I just want to make sure there isn't anything else to add. And that was somebody asking if it's better to mix vaccines with their booster, get it different than what they got originally, or if they should continue with the same type.
Right now, most of the recommendations are to be able to get the same type, but Dr. Mint also points out that there was a recent National Institutes of Health study that looked at mixing and matching. And there was another study that was done in Britain called COMCOV, or COVCOM, I can't remember which way it was, that showed that there was actually a little bit of benefit for mixing. And And so the FDA is now looking at that. I'm not exactly sure the time frame. Dr. Mint might know more about it than I do, but I think that we may be getting to the point now where clinicians who study these sort of things may have a little bit more latitude to be able to go ahead and do that. One thing that we can say from the studies that we've done before is there are no safety signals about mixing vaccines. It seems to be that they're quite safe to be able to put them together. And the advantages and disadvantages, well, we'll see what the actual information comes out when the full NIH data comes out. And there's a lot of studies out there that are looking at a variety of different mix and match. Most of the vaccination mix and match that we've looked at is with things like, which we call vector vaccines versus mRNA vaccines. The vector vaccine is J&J and AstraZeneca, but there are a lot of other ones out there too, which people are curious about, like Sinovac and those things, and they're being studied elsewhere in this world. And that information is coming slowly, but we'll have to see how that goes. At this point, we can't make too much in the way of recommendations for mixing. It's just not being recommended at this point, but more to come about that. And I suspect we will be soon.
Excellent. So let's go to our next topic. I know this has been on a lot of people's minds, especially lately. So I want to make sure we talk about vaccines in children and the concerns about in-person classes, kids that are too young to receive the vaccine, and kind of everything that's associated with that.
Yeah, I have to say that early in the epidemic, I remember coming to work one day and I'm listening to Jeff Duchin talk about being extraordinarily reluctant to recommend school closures in the early days of the COVID outbreak, because he did it in 2009 when we had this big influenza epidemic. And he said it was incredibly disruptive to our society. It was disruptive to the kids' education. It was disruptive to the parents. It was hard on everybody's mental health. And it really did a number on our economy too. And I think we're still seeing that. We have 4.3 million Americans, people who are out of the workforce. And I think this whole issue of, school and childcare and whatnot has a lot to do with that. So all of that really proved true, unfortunately, when we actually went to COVID. So now, I think there's a lot of impetus toward trying to open up education again. And again, it's better for the kids. They have a chance to be with other people. They have to focus more on their education. There's a lot else going around them. It's better for the parents to be able to go out and be able to pursue their occupations and hopefully not be on the edge economically. And it's good for our economy, gets people back to work. And you can do it, actually, because there are studies that show that that actually was the case. There was a big study that was done in Utah in the spring of 2020. And this was before vaccines were widely available. And they found that they could reopen their schools safely, even without a huge vaccination situation, which is, of course, the case for our kids now who are between 5 and 11 years old to go to school. They're not eligible for vaccination. So we have to rely on the old-fashioned things we've been talking about since the beginning of the epidemic. It turns out that in that Utah study, the critical issues were the same things we always talk about: wearing masks, washing your hands. They kept kids 3 feet apart for the most part. And so the sort of stuff that we've been doing as far as being able to socially mitigate this disease were the things that could allow these kids to come back safely. They actually studied a couple of kids who wandered back into school who had got infections at home, and they studied how well it spread within the community of that school using just masking, distancing, hand washing, and they found that the spread of the disease was less than 1% from those individuals in that school. So we can do this, but it requires a tremendous amount of cooperation on everybody. We can send our kids back safely to school, but we have to use masks. We have to be able to make sure that they keep kind of a distance from each other. We have to make sure they wash their hands. And when it's possible, we really have to emphasize getting them vaccinated. Otherwise, the last part of this is that if you feel sick, you have to stay home. And we don't want that to be happening too often for our kids. It's too disruptive for their education. So we really have to bear down on some of the simple ways that we can go ahead and try and keep the schools open by using some of the stuff that we've been talking about literally for years now. So it can be done. It obviously is going to be a lot easier to do once we have vaccinations. Dr. Mint pointed out that they're probably going to take the issue of childhood vaccinations to the FDA on the 26th of this month. So they'll be looking at that. So that's going to be welcome news. And hopefully we'll be able to roll those out to kids in the not too distant future, which will give us even more protection in school. But, you know, if we can keep the basics going, we can still be at school and have low risk of having disease spread there.
So I want to ask this one question on this topic. I might kind of combine two because I want to get to the next one before we run out of time today. But it's essentially, should vaccinated children be allowed to go to in-person classes when they've been exposed to somebody who tested positive for COVID, knowing they still have an opportunity to spread?
Yeah. So the CDC's point of view on this, when it comes to vaccinated people, if you were to follow it completely, is that those people do not have to quarantine. They can continue to go to work, they can continue to do their social stuff, but they probably should be tested in about 3 to 5 days. And clearly, if they develop any symptoms, they should be removed from the situation and retested, even if they tested negative once. It can be done. Now, this is something which not a lot of school districts have been able to implement. It's a very costly strategy for dealing with this sort of problem, but there are definitely ones that are talking about this as a way to be able to keep vaccinated kids in school by just going ahead and testing people who have been exposed and even people who appear to be ill. Because again, as we go into this winter, we're going to see a lot of other respiratory diseases which are not COVID. As Dr. Mint has pointed out, influenza, RSV, parainfluenza, the old-fashioned coronaviruses are still circulating. All those things could be different. So we might find a way that testing becomes critically important again, like it was at the very beginning of our epidemic, and tracking and trying to be able to keep certain critical kids out of school to try and keep the rest of them there. So, you know, I'm not sure I really have the answer to that question completely because we don't have all the tools to be able to do that. But and when we can get those in the case, it is actually safe to send somebody who's been exposed to school if they're fully vaccinated.
Yeah, and I want to point out one of the key things in everything we're saying here is that this is an ongoing, there are a lot of ongoing studies on how we can be more effective in regards to protecting the kids, protecting those that teach them, the teachers, and the families that the kids go back home to. So more and more information to come. And a lot of this is research in progress that we'll continue to track and we'll continue to push out the latest and best information.
So this next topic that we have is kind of a bigger topic. There's a lot of information out there for people to take in. It can be really hard to know what's real. So this has become pretty relevant lately when we look at the potential treatments, cures, preventative measures people have taken to combat COVID. Can you talk about what you know regarding the possible treatments that have come up, like the use of ivermectin or the new pill created by the company Merck?
So, you know, I think that the framework that I'd like to put in here is what I mentioned earlier, is that we're all trying to making risk benefit analyses, right? Should I eat that donut because that could lead me to have, you know, heart disease? Or, you know, what are the right ways to exercise to minimize my risk of stroke and heart attack? And even if I do that, can I make that risk zero? And how do you balance those things? And what I'll say is that there's just a lot of information out there, whether it's in the traditional medical literature, over 2,000 articles a week being published on COVID for the last, probably, 18 months, when we got it well into COVID, 2,000 articles a week. This is on the traditional scientific literature. And what I'll say is that there's a lot of things out there, and this predates COVID. When we look at other therapies for other significant diseases like other infections or cancer, there's a lot of things that work in the test tube or on mice or on other models that don't end up translating into human efficacy, right? And sometimes there's safety concerns that come from that. And what I'll say is that, ivermectin is probably a good example of one of those that have some promise. And I'm not an anti-ivermectin person. In fact, as an infectious disease person who does travel medicine, I've actually given a lot of ivermectin for its more traditional uses as an anti-parasitic. But that being said, for COVID, there are active studies going on. There are at least a dozen active studies going on right now studying whether ivermectin is effective or not. What I'll say is that the ongoing studies that have already been published are mixed. Some have shown some benefit, others, and especially aggregate analyses, like what we call meta-analyses, when you put a bunch of studies together and look at those studies across, have not shown as much benefit as we would like to say that it's safe and effective to use for people. So ivermectin is one where I'd say not quite ready for prime time. And in a similar way to how we look at the FDA process for vaccine, we want the process to go through the measures that we want to make sure drugs are safe and effective. Ivermectin is going through that process right now. And I feel like sometimes, the hype behind certain treatments are a little bit ahead of where the evidence is from my perspective as an infectious disease doctor and as a scientist. And so that's ivermectin. And then, like I said, I don't consider myself anti-ivermectin, but I would say that the evidence is not quite there yet compared with other therapeutic options. And there are only a few in the outpatient setting right now. There's monoclonal antibodies, which has been emergency use approved, but not much else. So I understand why people want to look for other options. And again, this is work that's underway. The research is underway right now, and we'll learn more about ivermectin and other possibilities. One of the possibilities is a medication that has been submitted to the FDA, molnupiravir. I think I said that right, by Merck, which again, in relatively small studies, has shown some efficacy. And the FDA will go through its traditional process to see if the evidence is there to approve this medication, that it's safe, that it's effective, and get this out there. And even some drugs that we use on the inpatient setting that were released before, remdesivir and some others, have shown mixed results. I would say that even those established medications, we are continuously looking at the data that we accumulate to see whether or not they're ongoing effective, and we're continuing to learn from those. But even one of the more effective drugs is dexamethasone when you're hospitalized with the infection, and that's a drug that we've repurposed from prior. So I know that there's a lot of concerns that the drug companies are trying to get their drugs out in front. And what's interesting is that ivermectin is actually owned by one of the major drug companies also. And one of the most effective drugs for inpatient treatment for patients who are sick enough to be in the hospital is dexamethasone, which is a steroid, which is again not something that is pushed by any one drug company or another, but we found it to be effective in clinical studies and actually to be very effective for those patients who are sick enough to be hospitalized or require intensive unit care.
Nobody has it out for ivermectin in particular. There have been many drugs that have been studied for this disease. A lot of them have been, as Dr. Mint said, repurposed drugs that have been fallen by the wayside, that just haven't met the standards of treatment. Ivermectin's still in the fold, but there are lots of them that have fallen by the wayside. So it's all has to do with their ability to prove that they're useful for our patients, and that the risks of giving these drugs are better than, the benefits of getting these drugs are better than the risks of doing so. So, I mean, it's not just ivermectin, it's the whole crowd.
We've got just a couple minutes left. The last topic I want to try to touch just a little bit on is pregnancy. Vaccines in pregnancy. Is it safe for pregnant women to be vaccinated? Is there any reason for people to be concerned about future fertility issues because of the vaccine?
Well, it is important to be vaccinated. I'll say that right out if you're pregnant. Pregnant women are more at risk for COVID complications than women who are of the same age who are not pregnant. They are about 5 to 6 times more likely to be admitted to the hospital sick. They're about 10 to 14 times more likely to be put on like a mechanical ventilator, which you've heard a lot about, and about 10 to 15 times more likely to die than non-pregnant women of the same age. So pregnant women are at risk. We have to down tune our immunity to have a baby in our bodies, and that comes at a cost of being at risk for infection. Not only that, the babies do worse. If you get COVID and you're not vaccinated, they tend to be lower in birth weight. They're 2 times more likely to be premature and about 2 times more likely to be stillborn if you have COVID than if you don't and you're pregnant. So there's a lot of morbidity to having COVID disease if you're pregnant. On the other hand, vaccines in pregnancy have proven to be quite safe. There's been at least one study now that's looked at 2,500 women who've gone through 20 weeks, who had their vaccination less than 20 weeks of pregnancy, who have gone through delivery without any major evidence of complication to the vaccine. There was another one that had about 1,800 women involved in it that showed that pregnant women have no more problems with reactions at the time they get their vaccine than other women who are not pregnant. And there are at least three separate CDC systems which are following the safety in pregnant women. There is the VSafe system. There's actually a VSafe specific pregnancy registration. There's the VAERS system, and the Vaccine Safety Data Link are following. At this time, last time I looked at it, 166,153 pregnant women who have gotten vaccinated looking for problems, very similar to what we did with the larger populations overall looking for problems, and they have found no serious adverse effects specific to pregnancy associated with vaccination. So there's a lot of good reasons to be vaccinated if you're pregnant, and vaccines don't appear to be detrimental in any way. The other thing that I just remembered that's important is that the babies, there was a recent study that showed 100% of babies, when you looked at their blood, which they get from the cord when the babies are born, have high levels of anti-COVID antibodies in their blood. So in a sense, if you're pregnant and you get vaccinated, we're still trying to figure out when the right time for that is, like we did with Tdap. But you could be protecting your baby for as long as 6 months after they're born if it acts like it does for other infectious diseases. You could be providing your baby with a lot of protection, which I think is like super important too, to protect them from this disease. You know, they don't die like other people do, but they do get impressively sick.
And I only point out what I mentioned earlier, 6.6 billion vaccine doses. Not all of them are the same ones that we've given. There's Sinopharm and others, AstraZeneca and others that are not approved here in the United States. But many other countries, including other countries with very, very robust drug safety programs like the European Union, Japan, Taiwan, many, many others, have done a lot of safety research, not only in pregnant women, similarly to the work we're doing here in the United States, but have also shown no real clear safety concerns in pregnant women or babies that have had this.
As far as we're concerned, it's all good. It's all good.
Excellent. So
Specific to the issue of fertility. There was some people have analogized the spike protein that is used to immunize people for COVID with something called the spike protein that was involved in a protein called syncytin, which is used for prolonging pregnancies. They are totally different molecules. There's no evidence whatsoever at this point that there's any increased infertility for people who get vaccinated at this point. The basic chemistry that people were citing for this is not fundamentally correct. And, as we look at people rolling out with the vaccinations, we don't see any signals that there's any fertility problems associated with being vaccinated at this point. And again, 6 billion vaccines. It's a lot of vaccines.
a lot of vaccines.
It's like that trillion viruses. I'm still getting kind of weird thinking about that.
So we're pretty much at time. We've got a couple minutes left. Do you guys have anything you want to add before we let everyone go for the night?
I'll only add that, I understand that there's a lot of concern. There are a lot of unknowns, and I don't want to make it like Dr. Horry or myself have all of the answers. We're continuing to look at the literature. The disease is really, it's really a significant disease that's caused a lot of mortality and morbidity, as Dr. Horry mentioned earlier. In our communities, it's a novel coronavirus that just we've had no native immunity for. And it really has ripped through and caused a lot of health concerns. I completely understand why people have significant concerns when it comes to anything new that's out there. And I would always just say, talk to your providers, talk to trusted folks to give you medical advice. There's a lot of really strong advice out there, and it's kind of the world we live in right now. Some physicians, although I will say, not generally speaking, folks from Dr. Horry or myself who've been lifelong infectious disease doctors. I mean, that's been our entire practice for our professional careers. But there are a lot of really loud voices out there. And I think that, you know, one of the things is just ask kind of what would make you feel safe before COVID. You know, did you want the FDA to go through the process of evaluating drugs like ivermectin or like the vaccines? And how can we sort of work together and talk to trusted, you know, trusted folks that can help you make these medical decisions? And they are hard decisions. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen to you know, the perspectives that Dr. Horry and myself have brought here.
I agree with Dr. Mint completely. I mean, there is a level of angst out there that people feel. I mean, there's a lot of information out there which could make you worry about this sort of stuff. You know, sometimes you have to just go ahead and bear up and do it, even if you're very concerned about it. It is for you, it's for your family, it's for our society. And sometimes you just have to kind of suck up a little bit of the anxiety and go ahead and do something. And I know the anxiety is real. I mean, it is there and it can turn your stomach. I've had lots of patients who felt like that in my clinic. And, you know, we just try and sit down and try and reassure you that we've done everything we possibly can to make sure that this is a safe, effective thing to do. And we just want to reassure you that, you know, even if it does make your stomach churn a little bit, we still think it's the right thing to do.
Thank you so much for being here today. It was so helpful. Thank you, MultiCare and the Covington and Maple Valley Chambers of Commerce. Dr. Horry and Dr. Mint, we really appreciate your time. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you all have a good night.